March 11th, 2025, Transportation Secretary Duffy, his words. I think the question is, when this data comes in, how did the FAA not know? How do they not study the data to say, hey, this is a hot spot, we're having near misses, and if we don't change our way, we're going to lose lives? That wasn't done, Duffy told reporters Tuesday. Investigators uncovered 15,214 near-miss events between 2021 and 2024, where aircraft were within 1 nautical mile of colliding with a vertical separation of less than 400 feet. Additionally, there were also 85 cases where 2 aircraft were separated by less than 1,500 feet with a vertical separation of less than 200 feet, according to the NTSB. Shocking stuff. So today I'm going to give you some very basic but deep insight into what we learned when I went to college to be an air traffic controller. I graduated in 1990 with a 2-year associate's degree. It was an accelerated course at that time where you had to get a 90% or above on the air traffic control FAA exam to get accepted. 20% of the class got a 90 or above, so it was an 80% washout rate. Now, if you didn't get a 90 or above after you got your degree, you could elect to go on and get a 4-year degree, and there's some other avenues at that time that you could get back in and be a controller, and there were there were members of that class that went ahead and did that. They say that the washout rate is anywhere from 50 to 60% overall. So and that was about the understanding at that time as well, but that's current as of today. So I was accepted to go to Oklahoma City, ended up not pursuing it. Long story there, won't get into it. But that's my background in air traffic control. Know a handful of air traffic controllers that I went to school with that are now either retired or retiring. The ones that haven't retired yet are supervisors, of course. Also grew up on a private airstrip. I'm going to put up my aviation background so you can go over it because we got a lot to talk about. But basically, grew up on a private airstrip, flew for about 48 years with my parents, mostly with my dad, about 40 years of that in the right seat as a pinch hitter. I've got 550 logged hours. All my left seat time was in our Grumman AA1 trainer that my dad bought when I was 11 years old. That's where I really did my hardcore learn to fly, land takeoff, stalls, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. So anyway, mostly flew piston twins. We had 2 Cessna 310s, a Baron. We also had a Bonanza that we did have a catastrophic engine failure in the late 90s at about 900 feet AGL, Goodland, Kansas. There's a video on that. We put that into a field, gear up, flaps up. Everything was cool. We went to Wendy's afterwards. But anyway, so I've got a lot of background that I can share with you. I've also talked to a lot of young people over the years that wanted to be air traffic controllers, wanted to know what is school like, what recommendations I would have, those kinds of things. And one thing that is really alarming that is still true to this day that was true then was that the majority of all air traffic controllers, in such a high percentage they can't even calculate it, have 0 flight experience of any kind whatsoever. 0. When I say flight experience, I mean any kind of instructional training. So I always tell young people that I talk to, and I'll tell anybody now, if you want to be an air traffic controller, go out and get 10 hours of flight instruction, fly into the control areas, like going into areas where you have to be in contact with ATC, okay? We're going to get into this terminology as we go forth. We're going to talk about the last 3 midair accidents that occurred in the United States with commercially controlled airliners, okay? Prior to the DCA crash at Reagan National. I'm talking 35 years ago. So we're going to get into this. Now, I want to show you. So let's go ahead and start. And I'm just going to go right through it. I've got a quasi diagram of DCA. I grabbed a bunch of my grandson's toys. And so here we go. We're going to take a deep dive. I'm just going to take it from the top. So let's go. My first day of class, it was at Green River Community College, and that would have been in 1988. When you walked we walked through the door of the classroom, you saw this. It was a gigantic picture on the wall, a mural. It had to have been 10 feet wide it had to be 10 by 6. It was monumental. And every day you walked into class, you saw this. And one of the first things we were told in class was, how many times should a commercially controlled aircraft have a midair collision in 100 years? Okay, what's acceptable every 100 years? And the answer, 0. So that was always a reminder that you are responsible for this right here. You are responsible 100%. It's on the controller. This is what we were taught, okay? We were taught this. And our instructor was a great guy. When we moved up from the Portland area to Seattle, we rented his house, which is on S36 Crest Air Park, now known as Norm Greer Field up here in the Seattle area. He was a pilot, one of the rare ones, and he was an air traffic controller, and he was fired during the Reagan years. So I learned a lot from him. We did a lot of deep dives. Because of my flight experience, we were able to talk about things. This accident occurred September 25th, 1978. It was a 727, had a midair collision with a Cessna 172 over the San Diego area, California. 144 people were killed. This includes both airplanes and people on the ground. You can see right here the collision ratio. The probable cause was that this is the PSA airliner, okay, did not maintain visual separation of the Cessna 172. What happened? Well, they lost sight of the Cessna 172. And in communicating with ATC, it became convoluted. In other words, the crew didn't hear all the instructions and vice versa. The transmissions from both the crew and ATC, they found later to be a little bit garbled. And so what one side thought they were saying and hearing was different from what the other side said. Now, the 172. They were doing instrument instruction. So we had 2 pilots on board. One was under the hood, we call it. That's where you have something over your eyes, so all you see is the instruments. Well, they drifted off course. So they were supposed to be over here like this, and they drifted this way into the flight path of the 727. The 727, again, lost sight, overran the 172, and that's what happened. Now, the next one, and we're going to talk about 3. This is an Aeromexico DC-9 that had a midair collision with a Piper PA-28 Cherokee. And this was August 31st, 1986, over Cerritos, California. 82 people killed, including both airplanes and on the ground. You can see there, this is the only known photograph of the DC-9. And basically the tail was impacted by the Cherokee, you can see here. The probable cause of this accident were the limitations of the air traffic control system, I'm reading this, to provide collision protection through both air traffic control procedures and automated redundancy. Factors contributing to the accident were the inadvertent and unauthorized entry of the PA-28 into the Los Angeles terminal control area and the limitations of the see and avoid concept to ensure traffic separation under the conditions of the conflict. Now, something else about this accident, there was also a Grumman, which is another four-passenger GA airplane, much like this Cherokee here, that also flew into the terminal control area. The terminal control area we'll talk about in a second. So the controller was busy dealing with that airplane and lost the radar track on the Cherokee. So that was something that occurred. And so again, this is in controlled airspace. All commercial aircraft are controlled by ATC. And the last one, I just got a little note here. The last one was April 9th, 1990. So I was actually in school at the time. This was an Embraer EMB 120 that had a head-on just after takeoff at 5,000 feet with a Civil Air Patrol Cessna 172. The 172 was flying into the blinding sun, and it impacted the tail of the Embraer. And it took part of the tail off, but the Embraer was actually able to make it back. And the probable cause on this accident, this is an Atlantic Southwest Airlines Embraer EMB 120 Brasilia commuter. And the Brasilia managed to make an emergency landing, although tragically the occupants of the Cessna were fatally injured. Before radar contact had been established with the ASA Brasilia by ATC, the two aircraft collided head-on in the vicinity of Gadsden, and I believe that, yeah, Gadsden, Alabama, at a range of about 2.5 miles south of the airport. 2 were killed. Probable cause: the inadequate visual lookout by the pilots of both aircraft, which resulted in their failure to see and avoid oncoming traffic. A significant factor related to the accident was the sun's glare, which restricted the vision of the Cessna 172 pilot. So anyway, and then we go 35 years later, and we're talking about the DC-8 crash. Now you can see I've got these goofy toys all over the place. Now, this is basically just a cheese ball outlay of Reagan National Airport in DC. Okay, and you can see these little pink string. Those are the glide slopes. We'll get into that in a second. We got little markers over here. We're just going to do a baseline. We used to have exercises in class where we had a gigantic airport that was the size of this living room, and we would have airplanes that, real big airplanes that the students would hold, and they would all walk really slowly, and then you would be the controller and you would control them in this, what we call this terminal control area. So I'm kind of doing a quasi example of what this looks like, so you can see here. But first, before we get into this, I have to explain some baseline terminologies to you so you can understand what the heck we're talking about. And we're also going to talk about these sticks, right? You're never going to look at two sticks the same way again, folks, okay? So let's go ahead and get into some of the details of this. Okay, so we're going to do some basic definitions of some stuff with you. All right, just some simple terminology. The first thing that you all know what an air traffic controller is, ATC. There you go, okay? Now, the next thing is called the TCA. The TCA is the terminal control area. What is the TCA? So when we look at this airport over there, let's imagine here we have this bowl, okay? And you see in the middle we've got that little coin. That represents an airport in a terminal control area. So an airport in a terminal control area would be a big airport, like DCA, like SeaTac, like whatever, Houston, Hobby, you name it, okay? So the airspace that's controlled, so here we got our coin in there, you look at that, we put this down, and from the ground up is all controlled airspace to a certain height, okay? So this is a quasi-cheesy example, and it can be shaped a little bit different ways. They call it kind of an inverted pie, whatever. But this, anything that flies into this, so if we have somebody that staggers in, like in those first two accidents that we talked about where an airplane flew inadvertently into the TCA, they were in the terminal control area. What does that mean? That means all aircraft in this airspace must be controlled and separated by ATC, period. Okay, that's the TCA. If you fly out of it, okay, then, and like if you're flying what they call visual flight rules, so you have IFR, which is instrument flight rules, and you have visual flight rules, which means you don't have to be in contact with ATC. So all the general aviation flying we used to do, most of it, we would be VFR. We're our own controller, per se. We're just keeping our own visual separation from other aircraft, doing whatever. But at certain altitudes and airspaces, you had to contact or be in contact with ATC. Okay, so that's what the terminal control area is. All right, so there's that. Now let's talk about something else. Now we want to talk about something called TRACON, which is the Terminal Radar Approach Control. What in the world is that? So here's my little quasi tower, okay? So on the top of the tower, you've got windows and you've got tower controllers. And in the base of the tower, you're going to have departure and approach controllers, okay? This is part of the TRACON system, okay? So what does that mean? Well, when we go back and look at our TCA, so here's our TCA, right? And so the environment in this house that we're looking at is going to be inside the TCA. So everything that you're seeing here is inside the terminal control area. All right, so how does this work between one big airport to another? Because you also have what's called en route air traffic controllers. So let's explain that to you. Okay, so let's say here we are in Seattle, all right? And we're going to go ahead and fly to DCA. How does that basically work? All commercial aircraft are controlled by ATC. From the moment this airplane is pushed back from the gate, it's in contact with ATC. It has to have clearance to even push back from the gate. Okay, 100% of the time, all the time, commercial aircraft are controlled by ATC. So we get pushed back from the gate. The ground controller's taking care of us, okay? And then we get switched off to the tower controller. The tower controller is going to clear us to take off, right? Now they have already contacted departure control. So how does this work? The tower clears you for takeoff. You take off. You're flying a certain heading, climbing to a certain altitude. Then you contact departure control. So then departure control, they take you and they're going to fly you up to a certain altitude, a certain heading. And then when you're en route, like in other words, when you're cruising at your cruising altitude, you're now in contact with the en route air traffic controllers. This would be like Seattle Center, LA Center, Boston Center, all this kind of stuff. So if you remember in 9/11, if you've ever heard those ATC tapes, they're saying Boston Center, flight 11, whatever. Okay, these are en route. So this airplane's en route. Okay, so we're en route to DC, and we're climbing up, and there's another 747. We must have separation from that airplane. Okay, and so as we go along through here, we're en route. We got a 747 here. We're en route. And now we're going to start transitioning into the terminal control area. And now we're going to contact approach control. So here we got our little nose of our 747. And I'll get my finger out of here. And okay, now we're approach control. They're lining us up. And then we contact tower control. And they're clearing us to land. And here we are coming into DCA. This is the glide slope. My little string here, and this is the imaginary line that the airplane has to be on in order to land on the runway. Okay, gang? So now let's talk about separation, okay? Because the whole thing is about separation. All air traffic controllers do is make sure and maintain separation of aircraft. So we're going to talk about basically best practice, all right? So what is separation? Separation is a requirement that airplanes cannot get within a certain space of one another. And this is something you could use any tool you wanted. This is one of the ones that we would use, like as an example. We wouldn't actually practice this when we did our simulations, but this is just to give you a visual perspective. So, in other words, we have the airplanes in the middle, okay? And this separation can represent anything. Let's say this is horizontal. This is 1,000 feet each side. So a total of 2,000 feet, 2,000 feet. Make up whatever number you want. Okay, but let's use 2,000 feet in this example. What does that mean? That means these can never, under any circumstances, can these sticks touch each other in any way whatsoever. Okay? So here's a simple, straightforward example. If you ever flown into a major airport like Chicago O'Hare and you look over and there's another airplane that's landing right next to you, well, they're not even remotely close. So at SeaTac, we have 3 runways. We have one in the center, one on the right, one on the left. We used to not have one on the left, or whatever side you're coming on, one on the right. Why? Because they couldn't airplanes could not land parallel side by side because the runways were too close together. So if you did this, they would hit. So what did they have to do? Build another runway over here. So now you can have parallel landings. When you have staggered like this, it makes the separation requirements greater because it's all about best practice, okay? This is what makes this DCA accident shocking. So we are talking about separation, okay? So how do we analyze that when you're talking about a facility? So the one thing we were taught was every facility, of course, is going to have its own best practice of separation. How they separate aircraft. What is it that is acceptable as far as distance, okay? So is it something like this? Or are they allowed to have less, right? Okay, so maybe this is 500 feet, whatever. Whatever the facility is, it's gonna have a best practice. And when I say facility, now we're transitioning to the tower because this is the area and the airspace in which the collision happened at DCA. What was the best practice there? And this is incredibly shocking, what I'm gonna read you here. From Jennifer Hamady, she's the chair of the NTSB. Currently, helicopters and airplanes can be as close as 75 feet apart during landing. 75 feet apart during landing. Hamady said the distance is insufficient and unsafe. She said, unfortunately, people lost lives and loved ones are grieving. Hamady sought to reassure the public that aviation is incredibly safe, but noted there are safety issues that need attention. Now, it's important to understand the NTSB doesn't change the law. They make recommendations. The FAA has got to do this, okay? Duffy on Tuesday vowed to seek congressional funding to begin work on a new air traffic control system that he said will be the envy of the world. He called the current system antiquated, relying on decades-old technology, but safe. The proposed changes will transform air traffic control from a system reliant on copper wires to one built from fiber, wireless, and satellite technology, which is great. You know, the thing is, so when I was in school, there was a movie that was made in the 70s. You guys might have heard of it. It's called Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And I'm guessing to say that it was like 1977. So I'm in school in 1989, and our instructor said, hey, how many of you have seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind? And like, okay, well, back in those days, you had like 5 channels and everybody went to the movie house, right? Or movie theater. That's how old I am. So of course everybody'd seen the movie. And he goes, yeah, you remember that scene in the beginning, like the first 3 minutes when those air traffic controllers out there doing their thing? And we're all like, yeah. He goes, yeah, the equipment was antiquated and out of date then. And he goes, that's the same equipment we're using today. So it's up to you to use your tools. And so a big emphasis was put on it. This is great what they're trying to do. I'm not taking away from that at all. But the point is, and it seems to hold true today, is that it's up to the individual controller to use whatever tools are in their toolbox. All right, gang, here's a little clip from that Close Encounters of the Third Kind, just to give you kind of an idea of the equipment that in some cases we're still dealing with in some regard, but definitely we're dealing with when I was in school.
Harry, keep an eye on that point out I gave you. He's on 122.5. I'll be right back.
Indianapolis Center, you have any traffic for Aries 31?
Aries 31 negative. The only traffic I have is a TWA L1011 in your 6 o'clock position, range 15 miles. And an Allegheny DC-9 in your 12 o'clock position, 50 miles. Stand by 1, I'll take a look at broadband of it.
Aries 31 has traffic 2 o'clock, slightly above and descending.
Aries 31, roger. I have a primary target about that position now. I have no known high altitude traffic. Stand by 1, I'll check low, over. Dick, will you check low altitude and see if they know who this is?
Could be a satellite.
Aries 31, I have the primary target now in your 10 o'clock position, 5 miles over.
I've never seen it like that. About an SR-71?
The traffic is proceeding northeastbound, no altitude readout.
Okay, Center. Aries 31, the traffic is turned. He's heading right for my windshield. We're turning right immediately and leaving flight level 350 now.
Aries 31, descend and maintain flight level 310. Break, Allegheny 444, turn right 30 degrees.
Get on the order of the 45th recon wing. See what the hell they could be testing up there.
Aries jet descending to maintain.
This is Indianapolis Center. Do you have any test operations in restricted area 2508?
Aries 31, roger. Traffic is quite luminous and is exhibiting some non-ballistic motion, over.
Roger, Aries 31. Continue to descend at your discretion, over.
Okay, Center. Senate pilot's discretion is approved. The traffic is approaching head-on, ultra bright, and really moving. And right by us, right now. Now, that was really close. Aries 31 is out of 340 on the traffic path.
Ask them if they want to report officially.
All right, kind of interesting, huh? So think about that. So even if you look at those tools, not bad tools. Let's talk about a couple other things before we get into what I'm going to do is we're going to look at this airport and I'm going to tell you what we seem to know what their best practices are or what they were before the accident, and then how we would look at that as an air traffic controller going and working that facility. Okay, so I'm going to explain to you how that was taught to us. But first, a couple things that I have noticed over the last number of years, because I'm an aviation nerd. Pronunciation was something that was taught to us that was a really, really big deal as far as how you communicate with pilots, like how you say a word, how you use an airplane reference. In other words, if this is our Cessna 310, okay, so our last Cessna 310 was November 5715 Mike, okay? Now, the reason you speak clearly is so that the pilots can hear you, but one of the things that we were taught is to use the airplane whenever possible. So we have a Cessna 310. That's known as a twin Cessna. So we didn't hear from air traffic controllers November 5715 Mike. We would hear almost every time twin Cessna 5715 Mike, turn right heading 150, contact departure 118.5, 118.9 or 5, okay, or whatever. So why would you say the airplane and not say November? And you hear that, I hear that a lot today, where I don't hear the airplane call out, and I just hear November. Not illegal to do it or anything, but why? If you went out and you think of the last car you bought, you noticed that car going down the road, right? So the whole point of it, there's multiple points. It's about situational awareness, so and also about keying your brain. So when you're sitting there on your couch as an air traffic controller, this is what we were told. When you're sitting on, by our instructor, when you're sitting on your couch, eating your popcorn, not literally, but in your warm and fuzzy being an air traffic controller, you have no idea what's going on inside the cockpit, how busy the pilot or pilots are, what kind of noise levels are in the cockpit. Okay, I can tell you that there's all kinds of different things that go on in the cockpit that can distract you. So when I hear twin Cessna 5715 Mike versus November 5715 Mike, the twin Cessna part's going to key my brain, like as if I just went and bought a new Civic yesterday and I see another Civic going down the road. Also, if we're the pilots that hear the controller talking to another airplane, let me ask you this question. So the controller says, November 3015 Whiskey, turn right heading 150, contact whatever. Or November 3015 Whiskey, traffic is a twin Cessna at your 12 o'clock, 3 miles descending out of 5,000 feet. Okay, versus if they say, instead of saying November 3015 Whiskey, they say Baron 3015 Whiskey. Okay, so they say Baron 3015 Whiskey, traffic is a twin Cessna at your 12 o'clock, descending out of 5,000 for 2,000, 3 mile, whatever. Well, if we hear that, I know what kind of airplane we're looking for now. That's right. I also know the capabilities of that airplane, the performance of that airplane, that kind of thing. Conversely, that Baron knows we're a twin Cessna. What if that's a 172? Different look, different silhouette. And so silhouettes, we had these big cards that they would hold up, with airplanes on them. And we would have to tell you what airplane that is and what its performance were. In other words, cruise, service ceiling, things like that. You had to know that as a controller. Okay, so I'm getting into this pronunciation thing. Pronunciation and how clearly you speak as a controller is very critically important, because let's pretend this. We got this water running, okay? This is simulating what's going on, what the cockpit noise level is, okay? So think of it this way. Let's go like this. So if we're doing a call out as a controller and we're saying twin Cessna 5715 Mike, turn left heading 150, contact departure 118.9 or 5, right? That's how we hear it as a controller, okay? But how does the pilot hear it? Well, turn the water on. And they might hear it like this. Twin Cessna 5715 Mike, turn left heading 150, contact departure 118.9 or 5. So it'd be maybe a little bit quieter because it's coming through the headset, right? And there's going to be muffled noise going on. So whenever you're dealing with anything related to separation, weather, anything that where I really need to make my point, winds. So there's winds, if the winds are high, we want to make sure that those pilots can hear that. So or acknowledge it. So I might read the winds to these guys twice. And if I'm concerned about what we call, what's the crosswind component? Well, quite simply, if you're getting a direct crosswind, and let's say it's 35 or 40 knots, that's about the maximum an airplane can crab into that wind and land. Like that. I mean, if we're just doing a roundabout, that's about the max crosswind component of, most airplanes. So if we know we've got heavy winds, I want to make sure that these pilots heard me. So I might give that, or I would probably give, we were taught to give that wind call out twice. One of the things that we used to talk about a lot, the instructor and myself, was the simple fact that it's not a requirement that air traffic controllers get any flight instruction, and the majority of controllers have zero flight instruction, and it seems crazy. It would seem a mandatory requirement that you would at least go get like 10 hours of flight instruction where you're flying into the terminal control areas, shooting some ILS or instrument approaches with an instructor, not even landing the airplane or doing anything, just having a ride along and filing the flight plan with the instructor so you have a perspective of what it's like to be in the cockpit. And that was something that you would really notice with students in the class, and that was a huge monumental advantage that I had over everybody in there. Was just, it all made sense to me, the three-dimensional world, because I'd been in it. That's what I'd been doing. Okay, so now we're going to run over the airport and we're going to go over this best practice. But remember this, we were taught that the buck stops with us. As the individual, you must use your tools. So let's talk about that right now. And this is make-believe, as far as I don't know what the best practices are at DCA, other than a few things, like, in other words, it was okay for these airplanes to be separated by 75 feet, which is unbelievable. But let's look into this. So let me show you. All right, everybody, this is my wife, Madison. She's going to help me a little bit with this best practice, okay? So the first thing we're going to do, we know that when we talk about separation through this corridor, that they were allowing 75 feet of separation. So when we're talking about using these sticks, if I have my wife hold a stick here, and obviously we would never want these to touch, right?
These are airplanes, right?
Yeah, in the middle is an airplane.
Okay.
Okay, so when we were in class, we used to do these kinds of scenarios. Now, the sticks that we're showing you were not what we had when we were, doing the airplanes in class. This is just a visual cue. We would have an airplane in our hand. But basically, if we're crossing, we can't cross like this, right? So then what would you have to do? You have to be here, right?
Right.
And then if I'm going to go above you, okay.
Right.
So in DCA, through this corridor, they were allowing 75-foot separation. This was part of their allowable best practice. And without getting into the other best practices, which would encompass what the 5 controllers do, what tools they had, and all that stuff, what we know that they did have was an allowable 75-foot separation. Again, shocking, okay? We also know that they had data and multifunction display at the tower showing the altitude and locations of the aircraft. So even if we use archaic tools like we do, like I have here in this example that we've done or going to do, they had automation in the control tower to see where the positions of these aircraft were. So I just have my wife hold this here just to give you kind of a perspective. So as the controller, you have this in your mind of where these airplanes should or should not be. So what we're going to do is we analyze, this is the best practice. So if you were a controller, and I'm a controller, and you're a controller, and you're going to this facility, you don't have to hold that up anymore, honey.
Okay.
But so our own best practice that we were taught has to be stricter than whatever the best practice that exists at the facility, right? So now think about it. If you're going to allow 2 airplanes to cross, so we have our Blackhawk and we have our CRJ, and we're only going to allow them to cross. So basically, this Blackhawk is allowed to pass within 75 feet of this. I'm not going to be comfortable, are you?
No,
So let's say that at DCA they go, oh yeah, that's okay.
That's their best practices?
But yeah, they were allowing that.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So we're going to make our own best practice, and let's say we're going to say, let's use these smaller sticks over here. And what we're going to do is we're going to say this represents 1,000 feet. Each one of these sticks. So in other words, this is a total of 2,000 feet. So if I've got my CRJ here, this is 1,000 feet. You have the Blackhawk in the middle, right?
Yeah.
So each one of these represents 1,000 feet. So if you're coming towards me, walk towards me, we can never have those touch.
Right.
That means the closest they would ever get would be 2,000 feet.
Gotcha.
Right? No matter what.
Right.
Okay? Not 75 feet.
Right.
Why would we want to have a best practice of 2,000 feet? Is in case these ever did overlap, we'd have a record of it.
Right.
Oh, they got within 1,500 feet. That's why when I read that there were these 15,000 some odd close calls, that doesn't mean that is bad. Now, if we had like 50, that would mean, oh, we're fixing it when they got within let's say 1,800 feet in this example, not running into each other. I hope that makes sense. And that's the best practice that we're going to change, and that we were taught to think about as controllers. I can just do that. And so I'll do an example of that in a scenario here. But a couple things I want to point out, and honey, you can help me with this. Okay, so before we get into kind of some scenarios here with the Blackhawk and the CRJ, I wanted to go over a couple things in this book. And this was an air traffic controller, one of our many air traffic controller books that we had when I was in college. And this was about how to go through the testing and some of the key things and aspects of being a controller. And so I thought I'd read a few things to you here that you might find interesting. So working conditions. Each controller is responsible at separate times for giving instructions to aircraft. These individual duties are rotated among the staff about every 2 hours at busy locations. Now, one thing we have heard is that controllers are overworked right now. So this was something we talked about. So every 2 hours at busy locations. At peak times, controllers must work rapidly. Mental demand increases as traffic mounts, especially when poor flying conditions occur and traffic stacks up. Brief rest periods provide some relief but are not always possible. Radar controllers usually work in semi-darkness. On testing, your application will be kept on file at the SEU. As FAA regions have positions to fill, applications are requested from the SEU to review for employment consideration. The applications on file with the highest scores for that region will be sent. Usually 3 applications for each opening. Normally scores below 90 are not reached or accepted. Like I say, if you go to college and get a 4-year degree, then you can get placed like we talked about earlier. Now this is an example of some of the stuff that we had to do on the test, and I'll just flip through some examples here, but the examinations the examination was heavy duty. Okay, and so as we go through, you would have these like symbol tests, and you'd have to see like what was related to what. All kinds of different questions. You could like simple question would be, what is the VHF emergency frequency? What is the UHF emergency frequencies? Transponder with no altitude encoding capability is what? DME transponder with no altitude encoding capability is blah, blah, blah. These are examples of some of these questions that we would have. I mean, it was very, very intense. The schooling was rigorous and very, very serious. This is the glossary, controller pilot glossary. It starts on page 225 and goes for a long time. Good Lord. So these are literally just all these different glossary of terms. So anyway, my point in just briefly going over that is just to outline the fact that there's a lot to it. There's a tremendous amount to it. So, okay. So now we'll get into kind of a scenario with this Blackhawk and CRJ that might bring all this stuff together. At the end of the video, I'm going to have the ATC audio of this crash, and when you listen to it, and I know most of you have already listened to it, it might give you a different perspective since we've gone through all this stuff and how you would think. Let's go through the scenario with the Blackhawk and what can we do with our best practice to separate these airplanes. So what do we know the basics of? So if the ground here is the Potomac River, okay, this is the layout. You see our glide slopes, so we know what pathway that the airplanes are going to go on or fly when they land, and we're going to have these markers here. So the Blackhawk takes off, and it's somewhere from about 1,750 feet, and it does a step down. Okay, and they're doing step downs, and I don't know the specifics of it, but you can read about it. I'm sure a lot of you have, but they do step downs at different altitudes, and the whole idea is to step down at different points and get to 200 feet and pass underneath the CRJ. Okay, so we know that that's what we've got going on. So we know the Blackhawk pilots had different information. One was getting a different readout than the other one on altitude, and there was some confusion going on in there. And so what ended up happening, the controller made the pilots of the Blackhawk the air traffic controllers. And we were not, that was a no-no as far as what we were taught. A pilot cannot be an air traffic controller. A pilot is a pilot, an air traffic controller is an air traffic controller. That was explicitly taught to us. As soon as you give separation to the pilots, you're in big trouble. And that's what happened here. Separation was given to the PSA crew solely to separate from the 172. They lost sight, and there you go. Okay? The controller in the Aeromexico lost situational awareness on the Cherokee because he was dealing with a Grumman, and that's what happened. The Embraer, the controllers were in-betweeners. In other words, the Embraer was in the process of going to departure off of the tower. Bad timing, but that's on the part of the controllers as well. So anyway, as far as how we were taught, okay? So the Blackhawk is approaching the glide slope. Now, what I want you to think of in this example is, let's put our CRJ right here. So actually, let's do this. Let's go over here. What do we kind of know that happened? Did you know that there was another company aircraft, a CRJ, that the controller asked to go to runway 33 that said unable and landed on runway 1 prior to the CRJ 5342? All right, so let's walk through this little bit of a timeline. So we're going to put our Blackhawk at position A, okay? and they're working their way this way. So let's go to the CRJ, flight 5342. Okay, so here we have flight 5342 on the glide slope for runway 1. Controller says, hey, can you do runway 33 because they want to get another airplane out beforehand. So this will give a little more time to the controllers to get an airplane off of runway 1. 5342 transitions. Now 33 is over here, so now we're turning over here to the right. My quasi example. So now we're pushing closer to the Blackhawk. Okay? So now we're going to get lined up on the glide slope for 33. Okay, descending. Okay, so now I'm going to put this a fixed marker on here for flight 5342. So we're just going to leave this airplane here to give you this example of how we can move or do something in this situation as the controller. So this is all about understanding where all these airplanes are. And there were 4 other controllers in there. So how are you utilizing those controllers? That's a part of best practice. The whole environment inside there is a part of best practice. How you use it. How are we using these tools? I know I'm being redundant, but this is critical. Now, you remember earlier we talked about performance. What a controller needs to understand baseline performance of these aircraft, any aircraft they're going to control. You go to school forever. I mean, it takes 2 or 3 years, even when you go to Oklahoma City and then go to the facility. We used to go to the en route air traffic control center in Seattle all the time. It takes a lot. It's unbelievable that this happened. But anyway, so I need to know the performance of this aircraft. And even if I didn't, I have all kinds of other options as well. So this Blackhawk now is stepping down from 1,700 feet. So let's say for practicality purposes, they're doing 80 knots. Now they're down 1,500, and so as we go to point B, they report in. So we're using archaic tools. So I'm going to contact the Blackhawk. Pat 25, are you at location B? Pat 25 responds, yes, at location B. Okay, so now they're stepping back down here. And are you at location C? Let's say they're at 500 feet, and they respond back, yes. Now, when we look over here, there's our glide slope. So what's the next point? Before the Blackhawk is going to turn inbound in this scenario, it's going to be point D, okay? And at D, we want them, let's say, to be at 200 feet, right? But let's say that the closure... So now they're coming to D, okay? Now here's going to be our position. This would be where the position of impact is. But let's say that right now, our Blackhawk is somewhere between C and D, and we get a position report on the CRJ that they're now transitioning from 1 to 33, coming over this way, okay? And let's say that they're over here and it seems like, oh man, this is getting kind of close. What could we do? Now, when I say kind of close, I mean we're totally in the safe zone here. They're not even remotely close, but we don't want them to get close. But we can see by the reports that there's going to be a crosser, and we don't want to have a crosser because we have our new best practice, okay, for separation. So we can simply, very easily in this scenario, slow the Blackhawk down. All right, so we can tell Pat 25 reduce to 40 knots. Report location D. So reducing, and so they acknowledge reducing speed to 40 knots. And now they report position D, and if everything went good and they slowed down, they would get to position D a lot slower than they would have if they were at 80. And our CRJ can just come right on down the line. But let's say that they don't slow down. They say they did, but they didn't. And now they're coming inbound, right? And we have our CRJ that's approaching. So what can we do? Well, we can have the CRJ go around. There should never be any instance where that would have ever been remotely close. And so when we're reading about this stuff, you're seeing it's going to be interesting to see what the fundamental breakdown was. So what would be the holes in the Swiss cheese? Well, that would be not good pronunciation. That would be poor best practice. That would be no flight experience, no understanding of what it's like in the cockpit. That would be poor usage of tools. So if you start to break down in little areas, little things, all these things that we were taught that are really important, then it can lead to disastrous consequences. And so the information that's coming out right now is, this has been going on for decades. It's been leading up to this for a long time. So the amount of change that's going to be required is going to be drastic. But the first thing, and I've heard that they are doing a little bit of this from what I understand, you've got to get into each one of these facilities. You start with the higher traffic areas. They need to overlay all the data that they have, just like they did here. So you take all these terminal control areas, okay? You take SeaTac, all right, because we live out here, and you need to pile that data together and how many close calls have been there, and you need to figure out what their best practice is, and you need to change something. But you have to look at the individual controllers. You can't do this on automation alone, and you can't expect cockpit automation because you have ADS-B and you have TCAS. I won't get into that because we're talking about all these different terms, but inside the cockpit of these airplanes, yes, you have traffic and collision avoidance. And I know a lot of people have talked about these accidents, and you can hear about what was going on in those cockpits as far as just what normal things occur and why they wouldn't be deviating, or they are deviating or whatever. But when you're inside a high traffic area, in a lot of cases, those alerts you might ignore because, for example, real simply, in the case of the CRJ, they were cleared to land. So should you have your head on a swivel as a pilot? Absolutely. But they're busy. They're transitioning from runway 1 over to 3-3. They're very busy in the cockpit. It's a shorter runway. Okay, so there's a lot going on. It's at night, and so the first officer, they're in a left bank. The first officer is going to have to be looking for this helicopter, kind of up and over a little bit, thinking it's below him. Like the first officer would believe, or I would believe that the Blackhawk is below or is low and behind. So if you are looking, and the wing is pretty far back on the CRJ, but if you're the first officer and you are looking for traffic, you would be looking low and behind, not he would have had to have looked, so let's say you got 12, he would have been, so the Blackhawk basically would have been 2 o'clock level with, it would have been 2 o'clock low because they're descending, right? But he's thinking that they're behind and low. 200 feet because they've flown that approach numerous times. So I would be looking over here, not there. You're going to be looking at your 4 o'clock position maybe, or something like that. The whole thing, so there's really nothing the CRJ pilots could do. So what ends up happening is the confusion taking place inside the cockpit of the UH-60. The controller has no idea. And as the controller, we were always taught, if you always assume the worst. You always assume the worst. Because if you assume the worst, then what do? Separate. Just maintain separation. A midair collision of a commercial airliner is the last thing that should ever happen. Like, it should never happen. Ever. Not even... So when you read about these 15,000 some odd close calls, well, there's mass monumental complacency going on there, and it's quite obvious. And so, people, 67 people died, and you think about those families, and some of you've seen the video where we've lost some friends, and I was in a situation where I was at a house where that had happened, and I've never seen anything like that. What families go through when that happens is beyond any kind of explanation how horrible it is, and it'll never go away. So those families have to deal with that tragedy and that horror forever, and it never should have happened. So I hope this kind of makes sense. I know it's a cheesy example, but I really wanted to get people to have a basic understanding of what our responsibilities were when we were in school. And again, I wasn't an air traffic controller. I'm just telling you what we learned and what I learned, and also things that I've seen. This was as simple as I could try to make it, but I hope it makes sense. If you have any questions or you want me to do any kind of follow-up explanation on anything, I'd be happy to. I hope this helps, and we'll talk to y'all later. Thanks for hanging out for an hour. See ya.
42 on Mount Vernon visual, runway 1.
Blue Chief 5342, Washington Tower 1 star 320 17, gust 25. You take runway 33.
Yeah, we can do 33 for Blue Chief 5342.
Blue Chief 5342, that's a Wilson Bridge, change to runway 33, runway 33, clear for land.
Change to runway 33 for land, Blue Chief 5342.
Pleasure 1, lander fault at the boardwalk, please on risk when they will report landing strip. Winds are currently 330 to 15, gust 25. Pleasure 1, roger for change for tonight. Pass 35, roger.
American 4782 by Baton, Mount Vernon visual.
American 472, Washington Tower 1 star 320 17.
Alright, this is wind. Did you see that?
American 472. American 3130, go around, turn left end 250, climb maintain 3000.
Okay, left heading 350, 3000, American 3130.
Tower, Blue Streak 5347 is on final. Request runway 33, circle to 33.
Second heading for American 3130.
American 3130, go around, turn left end 270, climb maintain 3000.
270 on the heading, 3000, American 3130.
American 472, careful landing clearance runway 1 continue.